As I'm recording this, it's the third Sunday of Easter, and the gospel corresponding to this weekend is kind of unique. So as you might recall, last weekend we celebrated Divine Mercy Sunday, and basically the story marking that particular occasion was how Jesus Christ appears to his disciples after the resurrection and says to them, "Peace be with you." But again, more to the point, today's gospel further expounds upon that original story by talking about the disciples' reaction. So what we hear is that they are startled and terrified because they believe that they're seeing a ghost. Now, in response to their fear, the Lord basically does three things, right? So first of all, he walks them through the Old Testament. He walks them through the Hebrew Scriptures, pointing out this recurring pattern about how specifically the Messiah must suffer and die before entering into his glory, right? So he's pointing out the Paschal mystery. In order to enter into the Lord's resurrection and glorification, you need to pass through the narrow gate of his suffering and death. But secondly, he eats. He eats a piece of fish. He eats a piece of broiled fish, to show them that he's not a ghost, but instead he's human and fully divine. And then finally, he shows them his hands and his feet, signs of the crucifixion, to point out, to highlight his own victory over sin and death, as a result of which the disciples finally give themselves permission to rejoice in the presence of the resurrected Christ. Now, for my money, this is where it gets kind of interesting, right? Because even if you are familiar with the basic structure of the story, I think a lot of people reduce it to a future-based thing, almost like a fairy tale. Like one day, someday, maybe in the future, my prince will come, and then there will be the resurrection. Every tear will be wiped away. There will be no more suffering and death. And certainly that's true, but what's being overlooked in that particular rendering of the text is the present moment. Because right now we are being offered a precious opportunity to wield enormous power, to participate and share in the power of the resurrected Christ. Because think of it like this. Whenever Jesus Christ shows up at a particular event or circumstance, that circumstance is changed forever. And so, for example, Saul becomes Paul, Simon becomes Peter. When Jesus Christ shows up at the wedding of Cana, weddings are forever transformed and elevated to the level of a sacrament. But more to the point, when Jesus Christ suffers and dies on the cross, human suffering, death itself, these things are changed forever. These things which we are inclined to fear the most, they become the very means by which salvation is brought to the world. And just kind of pause and think about that. That's an enormous thing, right? So it's not so much that Jesus Christ brings about salvation in spite of suffering and death. Again, it's precisely through these things that we're inclined to fear the most that he brings salvation to the world. That's how powerful God is. And more to the point, he invites us to share in the same power. And the primary means by which we're called to do so is to offer up our sufferings. Now, certainly that's a legit expression when it comes to Catholic culture, but I have to admit that I've always found that particular expression to be somewhat misleading, because it implies that we're called to do something to unite our sufferings to the sufferings of Christ, and then offer up this combination of sufferings to God the Father, whether we're talking about some act of the will or some weird breathing exercise, for example. Whereas the reality is that Christ has already done the work. Through his crucifixion, the Lord has already transformed human suffering forever. And so certainly it acquires a certain power, as we've already discussed, to bring about and facilitate the work of salvation. But also on top of that, our suffering is forever united with the suffering of Christ. And practically speaking, what this means is that regardless of what sort of suffering we endure, whether we're talking about a paper cut or some painful, prolonged illness, we are never suffering alone. We are never suffering in isolation, but instead, again, always our suffering is united with the suffering of Christ. Always in these moments, we are sharing in a unique and particular sort of way in the one true cross of salvation. So therefore, whenever we talk about offering up our sufferings, in a certain sense, what we're called to do is to simply remember. To remember the work that Christ has already done through his crucifixion and subsequent resurrection. Which means, practically speaking, that always our life has meaning, our suffering has meaning, and truly precious in the eyes of the Lord is the death of his faithful. Okay, now at this point, perhaps I might further expound upon these points we're making today by sharing with you a couple of examples. And so the first example involves the RCIA program, right? And so, as you probably know, the RCIA program stands for the Rite of Christian Initiation for Adults, and it's basically the program that the church uses to fully initiate adults into the life of the Holy Catholic Church. Anyways, in my first parish, when I was teaching RCIA myself, there was a participant, this young lady, who basically was struggling in terms of her final decision to become Catholic. And so I think she always wanted to become Catholic, but there was this kind of hesitation because she realized that it was a weighty issue. She kind of recognized the cost of discipleship, and so she needed more time. And so she wasn't received at the time of the Easter Vigil, again, because she needed more time. And so, as you might imagine, as a result, over a period of weeks and months, she and I talked about different issues in the office. But after a while, I realized that she needed something else. And so it just so happens that around this time, there was someone I knew from the parish who was basically dying, as a result of which I was called to their home to anoint this person before she eventually passed away. And so because I knew this person, we had a conversation about a whole variety of things, including this young woman. And so what I said to this woman that I knew, again, before anointing her, was like, look, here's this young woman who's just finished the RCA program. And again, she's kind of hesitating in terms of whether or not she actually wants to become fully initiated in the church. And so I was hoping that you could offer up your prayers and sufferings for her. And she did, right? And so basically, subsequently after that, she died. And it just so happens that the day that she died, that's the day that this young woman decided to enter into the church. And I didn't tell her until the day that she was actually received in the church. And so I revealed this particular fact in the context of the homily. And I said, oh, and by the way, the husband of this person who was praying for you and offering up her sufferings for you is here right now. And so the two of them met, they hugged, and as you might imagine, tears were shed, and they remain friends even to this day. In any case, perhaps I might end with one final example, and this involves a funeral that I did recently here at the parish. And so again, this was a situation where before the person died, I had the privilege and the opportunity to give him the anointing of the sick. And as a priest, whenever you are anointing people or otherwise giving people the sacraments in their homes, it's always kind of a judgment call. Like what kind of situation bear in terms of in-depth conversation and whatnot. And in this case, I kind of knew the person who was being anointed, and he seemed to have a really strong level of faith, and so we were able to talk about a whole variety of things based on that. And one thing I kind of raised to him was like, look, because you're going through something which is really painful and difficult, because he was terminal as a result of a prolonged bout with cancer, your prayers are actually more powerful than the prayers of a priest. And so therefore, it's actually really important that you are extremely intentional about offering your prayers for particular persons and for particular intentions. And so I took the liberty of recommending to him actually certain intentions. And so, for example, I said to him, like, look, there's this family that I know that's really hurting. If you could pray for them, that'd be great. And there's this couple that's on the verge of divorce, right? And the wife in particular is really struggling. So again, if you could pray for them, that would be incredible. And then finally, the young people of the parish, especially the young people at our local high school, they are laboring enormously when it comes to broken families and lies proposed to them by the culture, by the prevailing world. And so if you could pray for them, again, that would be extremely helpful and amazing. And in response to all these different invitations to pray for these different people, to pray for these different intentions, the person in question obviously responded by saying yes. And the way he said it, I felt like that he would pray, but also pray with faith and love and a real sense of conviction, which obviously is the best prayer of them all. And the reason I bring this up, not just this last example, but both these examples in tandem, is to really emphasize the fact that even though there is obviously an enduring value to helping people in a tangible and physical sort of way, so think, for example, the corporal works of mercy, at the same time, there's always something really unique and necessary when it comes to offering up our prayers and sufferings for the salvation of the world. Because you always got to remember, for example, the Gospel of Matthew. Gospel of Matthew chapter 17. What does the Lord say? Just to kind of paraphrase what he says is that, in a certain sense, there are certain demons, certain issues, certain problems, certain forms of evil, which can only be cast out through prayer and fasting. In other words, prayers and sufferings offered in union with the sufferings and prayers of Jesus Christ for the salvation of the world. And may God bless you all.